I'm often asked, what can people do?
That's right. That's
Yeah,
my next
that's
question. You're high. What do we do next? What do we do next? And
yeah.
you're high. What do we do?
And my first thing is you do what makes sense and what you can do. So don't ever microwave in plastic. Don't put hot food directly into the plastic. Let it cool before you say store it. I mean, I haven't thrown out all my plastic containers. Maybe I should, but I don't put something that's really hot directly into the plastic, for example. Um, what's interesting is years ago, and I'm going back when 3M, which was the sole US manufacturer of PFOS, and they finally informed EPA in 1998 that, oh, guess what? We're finding this in the general population. They knew that from 1975.
Wow.
And they finally reported it. And then they announced that they would stop making PFOS by 2002. Um, do they were going to stop making PFOA also, and then it got transferred to DuPont, which DuPont in West Virginia, like in the 1970s and 80s, they weren't making the PFOA, they were using it to make Teflon, among other things. So I can remember learning around 2000 or something that don't ever put your bird in the kitchen, not if you're using Teflon pots, because if they get too hot, they off gas. And birds were exquisitely, unfortunately, sensitive to the PFAS. But I also learned, I knew, for example, that PFOS was in Scotchgard. And I very happily used to spray all my tablecloths or my, placemats, sometimes even clothes with Scotchgard so they'd be stain resistant. And I remember talking to some people I knew who worked at 3M. They said, oh, it's not a problem anymore. We're not using that anymore. Well, what were they using? PFBS, which has only 4 carbons, still lots of fluorines, basically does the same kind of thing. It is less acutely toxic. You're going to have to use more of it because its half-life in our body is shorter, but it does some of the same stuff. So, for example, I would probably not buy any clothing that has a label that says either PFAS on the label, which sometimes it will say now, or if it's totally water repellent, I want to know what it's made of.
Well, darn, Linda, I think I just killed me and Angie because I spent one day Scotch guarding all of our outdoor furniture pads
I was just
in the
thinking
in the
that.
garage. In the garage, just spraying it off, and then all the fumes are up there. Open the garage, put it out. So I
Probably
think that me and Angie might want to go get tested.
it might not be a bad idea. I mean, ventilation always helps.
But see, it's something
Well,
as simple as that.
yes.
We're
Well,
not.
some of the people who were more highly exposed was shown people's ski wax contained PFAS because it helped make you, ski faster. And the technicians who were putting on the ski wax had elevated levels in their blood.
Goodness. Well,
Right.
everybody out there, do not go buy, Scotch
Well,
I just did and put on your garden.
well, you might want to check and see what it's
Yeah, I'm gonna
in
do.
it.
I've got 2 cans.
You
So
know,
go look at it.
it might have something totally different. But we have a problem in this country
You
that
know.
you move from one chemical
Mhm.
that is a problem to another one that you
Right.
just don't know anything about.
And you mentioned that in your previous talk as well. You just move from one to the other, and they did that with BPA, did they not? Just once they
Correct.
went for BPA one, and they said let's not use it. They just went to another, was just as bad, maybe worse. So
But realize BPA is still out there.
right,
The only place it was actually banned was baby bottles and sippy cups. I mean, I think many of the manufacturers like to make Nalgene, and I'm just using that trade name bottles, but they switched to another BP.
Well, I do think that since we can mention it again, you mentioned the environmental working group, and I think that if people can
Mhm.
get on their website, go to their local area and see about their water contamination, see what they're exposed to, and maybe can factor into whether they get tested or not, because that really is an excellent website, or excellent source for knowledge and material.
Yeah, and I will say that they get the data, for example, as EPA is currently measuring throughout the country in municipal water systems. They do this every couple of years, and in 2023 to this year, they're doing that, and EPA puts that on their website, what the levels are found, and then EWG kind of takes it from there. And what we're finding is with the maximum contaminant levels in drinking water that were promulgated by EPA just last April. Of course, they won't go actually into effect until 2029. And at this point, we're not sure whether they'll be delayed further. But the point is, um, initially, say 10 years ago, when we first really began to become very aware of this problem, we thought, oh, it's just going to be a small 16 million Americans are drinking contaminated water. We now know that it's well over 100 million, and it may be as high as 200 million people are drinking water that will exceed these levels that municipal systems will have to meet. And of course, that doesn't do anything for you if you're on a private well. You need to get tested and find out what's in your well.
And even once people know what's in the water, it's often hard to figure out. I asked this question last time about the water filtration systems. Depending on what contaminants are in there, what filter system do you have? And then once you use those filters, the filters go back in the landfill, which then eventually it's all back in the system again. So,
Well, at least EPA proposed last year that PFOA and PFOS should be considered hazardous waste, at which point that the filters have to go into a hazardous waste landfill. Now, I'm not positive whether that ruling has been reversed, but I will say PFAS is a bipartisan issue.
that was one of the things also is what is the biggest roadblock, would you say, to getting the legislation passed so that policies can be changed to make a real, impactful difference?
Money.
Yeah.
That's right. Politics and economics, right?
Yeah, it all comes down to, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of money spent on lobbying, both our legislators and our policymakers, in the regulatory agencies. Removing PFAS like from drinking water is expensive. There's there's no two ways about it, which is why I believe we really have to dramatically cut down on our use. Um, I don't remember whether I talked about the issue of essentiality. Okay. So in the Montreal Protocol, which many of us are familiar with, that's where the chlorinated hydrofluorocarbons were banned because they were causing the ozone hole, which was getting bigger and bigger. And since that ban in 1992, I believe, the ozone hole has closed basically. But there were three kind of the approach that they used there was something called essentiality, which was if it's not essential, you stop using it. And I think we need to say that with PFAS. We don't need it to stain, make our carpet stain resistant.
Mhm.
Okay. If it's essential, but there is a safe alternative, and I stress the word safe. So something that either could be a chemical alternative that's been tested, or maybe it's a different way of doing things to achieve what you want to. You move to that safe alternative. And if it's absolutely essential and there is no alternative, you keep using it until you can find an alternative. So, for example, there are some very well-known pharmaceuticals which are PFAS. There are some very highly used pesticides which are PFAS. Some of the agricultural experts spoken to about the pesticides say, yeah, well, guess what? There are alternative pesticides that could be used. We don't have to use those. Some of the drugs, I don't know if there are alternatives, but the amount, the mass of drugs is much smaller than the masses that are used industrially for other processes. And it may be, we know that our medicine cabinet keeps developing with new approaches and new, the fluorines are put on certain medicines for the same reason that they were put on certain other things. It's to make them last longer.
Yeah, just like the fragrance and things like that that make, things smell nice. And I saw a toxicologist once saying if it says fragrance in the label, you should just absolutely not use it. And that's
Well,
hard,
because you don't know what it is.
right?
And it very well might be something that you don't really want to expose yourself to. I mean, I think that's another issue that we deal with is that we don't have adequate labeling,
Right.
so it's hard for people to know what's in this thing that I'm buying. And I would guarantee you that if you buy something and it says inert ingredients, don't believe it. There are many things that are inert when they're all by themselves, but when they're mixed with something else, they have an effect.
There is an app that's out there. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's I think it's YUCA. It's an app and you can scan the barcode on most consumer products and it will tell you if there are toxic chemicals in there or if there is a better alternative. It will make suggestions about that. We'll put a link to that on there as well because
I think that's there's another there's a Clearya, Clearya, which focuses on personal care products and cosmetics. And that sounds just like what you were talking about. And but that puts the responsibility on the consumer
Mhm.
rather than on the producer to be sure that what they're producing is safe.
Well, you'd mentioned earlier, so I mean, for our listeners to summarize a few things that, what you do is different than what you tell your grandchildren to do. So for all our listeners out there that have these young children or plan on having children, so if you could just give them the ABCs of what you would do, that from all your knowledge and how to avoid it, and what would you tell them? What would be your greatest pieces of advice right now to protect themselves best they can
Specifically with PFAS or in general?
in general and PFAS?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think, plastic is very useful, but we use too much of it. But I think if you can, just do not heat in plastic.
Right.
Simple, doable. You want a microwave, put it on paper, put it in glass, put it in pottery. Do not, that's an easy thing.
Well, I think
Um,
that's a great devil too, the microwave. And when I tell these younger men all the time when they come in with their low testosterone levels compared to a 60 and 70-year-old man with much better testosterone levels, I get back to the fact that look, there were no plastics and microwaves when he was young.
that's true. But okay, I was there. And they were miracle.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh,
It was,
Oh, I remember.
it was so exciting. But we've learned now that there's the downside.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think, the other thing is if you can afford organic foods in general are safer. Sometimes, no, but most of the time they are. Fresh foods. We know that there are concerns with the stuff that's so processed. I think that is something to avoid. I think, Keith, what you were kind of referring to is the point is that we understand now that development is the most sensitive time to effects being initiated. Whether you see them, say in the infant or the young child, no, you may not see them. So you're talking about young men with low testosterone. That may have had to do with something that their mother was exposed to when they were carrying them.
that's right.
Mhm.
And I think, and that makes it first of all, it makes it extremely difficult to track, to understand. So we have very few studies that are going on for generations, which is what we need. Um, there is a large NIH program called the ECHO program, which is early childhood health outcomes. And in many of those, they are involving a lot of pregnancy cohorts where they have samples from the mother during pregnancy, and then they're following the children. And that is starting to show a lot of, you can look for certain effects. There's a study that started in California, the Child Health and Development Study, in 1959 where they collected blood and urine from 20,000 pregnant women. And they have continued to follow those women, their children, and their grandchildren, and look at the associations that they can see in those populations. And there are a couple of other populations where that is being done. And I think that those studies are very difficult to carry out. They're very expensive. You can't be someone who likes instant gratification because it may take a very long time to see results, but they are absolutely essential going forward.
We've seen that. I've seen studies in women with polycystic ovarian syndrome with the high levels of testosterone during pregnancy.
Write that down.
And those children, especially young males, had higher levels of anxiety. And then it's like, okay, is it the testosterone that's causing that, or was it the insulin resistance that the mother has? So I think that's all fascinating and really important for us to learn more about and, continue all of the work that's going on.
Well, we know that the testicular cancer can often be associated with chemicals that heavy estrogen exposures. There's something called the testicular dysgenesis syndrome, and we know that there's an increase in cryptorchidism, which is undescended testicles, and we know undescended testicles are associated with increased risk of testicular cancer, and also hypospadias, which is where the tip of the urethra doesn't come out at the tip of the penis, but can be somewhere back, and we know that those things are induced in utero. And we're beginning to find, especially some of the behavioral stuff, that some of that stuff may actually be preconceptional. And I keep stressing that dads matter. So much of the focus is on the pregnant woman, what's happening to her, but what happened prior to conception is also important and is something that we need to consider.
Okay, so do you believe that we're approaching a turning point? We talked a little bit about this already in PFAS regulation and awareness. And what gives you the most hope in this fight, if there is?
At this point in time, I'd say the bipartisan nature is that our congressmen, our senators on both sides of the aisle are concerned about PFAS, whether they are concerned enough to stand up to pressure from the industries that make and use it, I do not know. But I think, the PFOA and PFOS are no longer intentionally made. And I say that because some of the very complicated PFAS that are now being synthesized can break down to give you some of these. And some of the PFOA and PFOS, and PFHXS, all three of those are listed in the Stockholm Convention, which 183, I think it's 183 nations have signed, not the US. But the Stockholm Convention calls for a total elimination of those. But again, those are three of this huge number. And I think that I strongly believe that we need to treat PFAS as a class, and we need to apply the essentiality approach. If I were still in charge of a large federal agency, and looking, at grants that I think would be appropriate to fund, one thing I would want to look at is how can we recover, say, from filters? Is there a way to recover some of the PFAS that are on the filter? So if there's an essential use, we can reuse what we already made rather than creating new carbon fluorine bonds.
I can't thank you enough for coming on again. I mean, you're just a wealth of knowledge.
Well,
Wonderful.
We appreciate it so much. It's fascinating.
well, I like talking to you guys too, and if I can be helpful, that's my mission right now.
Wonderful. Well, going forward, I would love to talk to you at another time on the fluoride issue.
Okay.
That's fascinating, and I know you've done a lot of work in that area. So,
Well, let's just say, Angie, that I've supervised a lot of work in that area. I haven't actually conducted the studies, but I am very aware of them. And this is quite controversial, but I think there are some relatively simple go forward moves that we should be considering.
Wonderful. I can't wait to hear.
Kenny. Well, then I think you're extremely brilliant and a, obviously a kind soul. The world is just a much better place with people like you, and we do appreciate individuals like yourself. Just
Thank you. I
wonderful
have some
to be
fun
in.
every day.
I'm sure you do. Well, we hope you the very best, and we cannot thank you enough about bringing your expertise on these topics, to share with us and our colleagues. So thank you very much.
Well, look forward to talking to you again.
Thank
To-
you.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.